I missed all
that
that.
stunned the camera there. So, of course, once we're on the other side, we'll be able to interrogate Luther and see what he really had in mind. So, hopefully he'll say, yes, those lectures you gave are right on target. But this is a significant event, and 500 years is a tremendously lengthy time. And I think that we have made enormous progress from where we started to where we are today, and we need to really celebrate that because we've come together as Christian men and women, and we've reconciled many of those things which separated us, no longer separate us, and we realize that we are stronger together than separate. And so I think you'll see, however, the rationale, the raison d'être. You see, this is a classy place, so I can speak a little French here. The reason for the Reformation to have occurred, and that's what we're going to look at first tonight, and then move to the Reformation itself. So the first lecture topic here is the eve of the Reformation. The time has more than arrived. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that all this background that we have laid, particularly in this last 1,000 years, knowing where the church began, and then, of course, how it, over the years, became a captive to the empire, and as a result of that, fell into many kind of, I mean, it's kind of, when you look at that 1,000 years, you see sort of an unraveling and a sort of a disjunction and a confusion and what I think is just sort of an appalling part of our Christian history. To see how it went off the rails and how, while there were many faithful that kept the church together and preserved the Orthodox faith, you'll see that there were so many that got captive to a kind of a human, the worst of human ambitions, and corrupted the institution, either by power or by personal ambition or by skullduggery of the worst kind, manipulations, even murders, and all kinds of things, all in the name of supposed Christianity. And so that is an appalling part of our history that we need to be aware of, so that we, they say people that do not know history are prone to repeat it. And so once we know what the errors were and the abuses were, then I think it cautions us even more to be vigilant lest those kind of things happen. So what really led up to the Reformation? In the main, it's the kind of things I'm talking about. One of the things that was happening is that political offices of the church were often politicized, so that people were being appointed to church, higher offices in the church, bishops, archbishops, even popes, were being elevated to those high and lofty offices for many times the wrong reasons and for personal gain or manipulation. So that you saw that even clergy that were put in parishes were put there because of nepotism, for example. A priest would be a nephew of somebody, and so they got to the bishop and they said, my nephew needs a job. Can't you put him in a parish? Well, he hasn't even been trained. Well, who cares? Just he needs a job. How much does it? See, I can't even find my wallet. It's, it's the widow's purse. See, this little widow's purse. A tuppence. So what you had was people buying offices, buying even bishops' offices. Wealthy landowners that wanted a sympathetic bishop that would keep everything under control, keep the peasants in line, and so on, would pay to have the person elected, so-called elected to office. So nepotism, or buying your way into ecclesial office, was an abuse that was widespread. The clergy were very uneducated, and this was a kind of a horrible travesty that, as you remember, it had been declared that the normative was to have people say the Mass in Latin. Well, it occurred that even up until Luther's time, there were priests that were saying the Mass that didn't have the slightest idea what they were saying. They were that uneducated. In other words, they hadn't gone through the channels, they hadn't been prepared, they had been brought into office, they were a friend of a friend, they had been appointed by somebody. And so we had priests saying the Mass that were just blobbing through the words, had no idea what they were talking about. Let alone the people who were by and large uneducated, couldn't read, and so they just were listening to bobbling and burbling and whatever, barking and whatever bee would, other bee would, I don't want to say barf, but I'm just thinking, you know, what other bees could be there. But that babble was just nonsensical because they had no idea even what they were doing. And then the moral life of the clergy had deteriorated so badly that on many occasions, and not just an occasional occurrence, priests would have girlfriends in the rectory. Think of that, and concubines, and sometimes there was a revolving door of women coming and going out of the rectory, and you know, it was kind of turn the other way, look the other way. Don't ruffle anything, you know. And so the discipline had declined enormously, so that even the bishops that were supposedly to have authority over the clergy were you know, not tending the chicken coop sort of thing. And turning it back and looking away, you know, well, nobody complains too much, let's, you know, let's let it go, you know. So there were all kinds of things, illegitimate children being born in rectories, and even in monasteries and in nunneries. Monks at one point got a terrible reputation of being scandalous moral behavior, and nunneries, there were several occasions in history that were written that turned out to be nothing but brothels. I mean, it really had gotten horrible. Now, you know, only the worst gets recorded oftentimes. And while we say that, there were countless other hundreds and thousands of you know, good and dedicated people that were doing their job. But those abuses always surface, and therefore it gives a bad name to the whole situation. So it's not without meaning that the Reformation would occur sooner or later. And so there have been numerous attempts at Reformation by dedicated clergy, by reverent and dedicated bishops, by popes that tried to get the thing corrected, try to make, you know, remove people from office that weren't functioning properly. But there were so many of these issues that it was just hard to control. For example, there were bishops that were double dipping. In other words, they would be bishops of two dioceses, two, in our language, synods, but a diocese is a jurisdictional area. And that's the older and most preferred term. Synod actually means a meeting, but these dioceses are these administrative districts because the bishops would be well paid. They were prince bishops, they were living lavishly and so on, often would decide, gee, if I could be bishop of two dioceses, I'd get double salary. Who would have thought that? And so they found that, you know, if you were a friend of the archbishop or the pope might just say, well, why don't you just run that diocese over there too? And so you get sort of double dipping. But what happened there is you would have bishops that weren't even resident in the diocese that they were supposed to preside over. Now, for example, in this particular diocese of Youngstown, Bishop Murray lives here, presides here from the cathedral, and looks after the clergy and so on in this diocese. Bishop Abraham Andy, who is our bishop, looks after the congregations in Northeast Ohio. He lives here. He's not living in Seattle, you know, but that's the sort of thing you had, you know, a bishop living in Seattle trying to run things here. Not that there was a Seattle in those days, but you get the point. In other words, you're so far removed from what's happening, obviously things can happen that are completely out of control. You just don't see it, you're not there, you don't know what's happening, you know. So that was a problematic thing. So all these things cause so much problem, and that some of the reforms began to come in different ways, in different places, at different times, by different people. There weren't, until Luther and Wycliffe and Huss, there weren't people that were bold enough, strong enough, wise enough, courageous enough to take on the whole establishment. And that really takes an enormous amount of guts. And so you would have little reforms, but you didn't have any lasting or major reforms until you had the major reformers. So if we're looking at the precursors of the Reformation, let's list a couple of things. Clergy ignorance, which I talked about, lack of education, the appointment of clergy rather than by merit. Clergy had given up preaching, by the way, but because you could hardly preach if you don't know anything. Well, I've heard some preachers sometimes on the radio or TV that preach and they don't know anything. But back in this day, they didn't prepare sermons. There were some reasons for that. Number one is that the people were uneducated, and you know, no public address systems or anything. But that was not the major cause. The major cause is just indolence, laziness, and the fact that they didn't know anything. They didn't know the doctrine. They didn't know the teachings, and so forth, and they were supposed to be shepherding the flock. So that becomes a real significant thing, no preachings. In fact, the Dominicans, which are one of these monastical orders, you know, like the Franciscans, Dominicans, Cappadocians, and so on, the Dominicans were founded as preachers. It's the order of preachers. And a lot of people don't realize when you see that, when you see Dominican order, it's the order of preachers, to say, well, I wonder what that's all about. Well, what that was all about is that since the local clergy weren't preaching and didn't know anything, the Dominicans would come in town and offer the sermons. How about that? Bill, we've got to find some Dominicans to come in and preach our sermons for us, right? But that was why that particular group committed themselves to public proclamation of the gospel and teaching. And so the Dominicans went around to towns and villages and so on, and where no sermons had been offered, the Dominicans would come into the parish and do preaching. They were more scholarly. That was their vocation, or their charism, as we call it. Not only was there not preaching, but the whole rural versus city dynamic came into place. If you were in a city, and here again, understand when we talk about city, we're not talking about in New York or big places, you know, with millions and millions of people. We're talking about larger communities such as maybe Paris and London and so on. They would tend to have educated clergy because there would be more educated people that would gravitate to a city, because there you would have the city government, you need lawyers, you need physicians, hospitals, and so on. So you had a more educated clientele. But it's certainly out in the suburbs and in the hinterlands, you had probably a 99% uneducated clientele. And so it makes sense that there you would have clergy that they themselves weren't, you know, the best or the brightest. You know, the jokes about the farmer's daughter or the traveling salesman, those jokes apply to monasteries and nunneries and parishes. Luther found it scandalous that cardinals were often viewed as saints because they preferred adult women rather than children. That would scandalize you, wouldn't it? He said, well, you know, the cardinals, they have their act together. They just like women coming in and out of the rectory. So it shows you how horrible, even if Luther had said something like that in terrible sarcasm, you can imagine what the situation was. So, now come the early reformers. Oh, I might say one other thing. The question might come to us of why this would be tolerated, why this behavior would be tolerated. Today, I mean, you know, there are scandals that occur, but, you know, as soon as the scandal occurs, pretty much it's dealt with quickly and so on, and people don't put up with it for years and years and years, you know. The reason is because of a very interesting one, that the church had the power over your soul. And it was very chancy, risky, for anybody to contradict the church authorities. Because the church authorities could always hold over your head, well, you caused trouble for me, you know, now in today's world, they'd say, if you cause trouble for me, you know, we'll sue you. But back in those days, you know, they're dangling your soul here. You want to cause trouble in this diocese? You want to cause trouble in this parish? Just remember who has your soul. And since the clergy are the gatekeepers of who gets into heaven and who doesn't, and who gets a good word and doesn't get a good word, you don't want to be on the bad side of your pastor or priest. I think we ought to get back to those days, don't you think, Bill? If I go like this, you know what I'm saying? I'm dangling your soul. Okay? But think of that, and the fear that was there. Remember, we had come out of the Black Plague. We had come out of this petulance and this pestilence, pestilence. And yeah, probably pestilence too. But the pestilence, the fact that death was on your doorstep daily. You know, no real good medicine, no real good hospitals. If people got sick, they died. You know, you had children died. You may have had 5 children and 4 of them died, you know, before they were 10. You had, you know, terrible things, you know, like leprosy and these, like the Black Plague, you know, where people would have these sores and this, you know, the odors of decaying flesh. And that was so much part of the culture that you were just one day away from death's door. So who, being one day away from death's door, wants to get booted out at the last minute, you know, get the big shoe from the bishop or the priest? And so you minded your manners, you kept your mouth shut, and you just tried to be in good graces. And that was a stifler for Reformation. Because if you, the consequences were too great to challenge the authorities. And therefore, you played along and minded your business. You know, you kept your nose clean. And I remember one professor I had at one time in college, he was a very arrogant and very ridiculous grader. He would find, you know, something on your paper of non-consequential nature to knock you down a letter grade. And I remember complaining one time, some of us went to the chairman of the department and we said, you know, he is so unfair. I mean, you know, he'll take off 10 points for a spelling mistake or something. Well, what does that have to do with, but I got all the right answers, you know, what the spelling mistake. You know, or anyhow. And we went to the department chair and he said, after he heard our complaint, and he said, let me tell you one thing. He has the power of the great book. Meaning, he ultimately will give you your grade. He said, my advice, say peaches. In other words, keep your mouth shut, do your work, and this too will pass. Next term you don't have to take it. But he has the power of the great book. And so if you're smart, you don't antagonize him and you play along. As painful as that was, that's a sort of small example of how people were, you know, addressing the situation that they saw most deplorable. You know, we would say, well, how could they tolerate that? Why didn't they get rid of it? You know, why didn't they, you know, get together and do this? Well, it's not that easy sometimes. You know, the experience of Third Reich Germany has always been a wonderment to people. They'll say, how could all of those good people, you know, in that land of Bach and Beethoven and Brahms and with all that high culture and fabulous, you know, you never see a scientist on any kind of film that speaks with a German accent, right? Right? Okay. Because we sort of think of the smartness of the German mind and mathematics and, you know, all that kind of thing. The Werner von Braun and the rockets, you know, the Einstein and all that. And so, you know, the wonderment is how could Third Reich Germany and all that horrible Holocaust and everything occur with all those good people, the land of Luther. Imagine. And if you think about that, of how the common person sometimes doesn't feel very powerful, or can't control it, you know, it's out of your realm. You can kind of sympathize with or understand what that situation was when the church was in that kind of deplorable situation. Remember, it's the power of your soul. Well, let's look at the early reformers then. John Wycliffe is a name that comes up early on, and in this community, interestingly, we have a remembrance of that name. Here in Austintown is a place called Wycliffe, right? Named after John Wycliffe. Interestingly, because people have forgotten that name, it's not as prominent as Luther or Calvin, but Wycliffe was one of the early reformers that you've read about in the book. But what his major contribution was is that he first began to realize that the common people needed to be able to read or to learn the Holy Scriptures and texts in the language, or at least hear the Mass in the language. And so John Wycliffe was an Englishman, and he argued for the civil authorities to take control of church property if the church had declined into such abuse and in marginal criminality. So he was the Bible man we know as Wycliffe. And actually there's a Bible translators group internationally called the Wycliffe Society or something, isn't it, Bill? Something like that. Wycliffe Bible Translators or something like that. So that name still remains. For those of you who are Eastern European, Slovak, the great reformer of the early church was John Huss, H-U-S. And now these are all predating Luther. Sometimes we get the impression that Luther was the first out of the gate, but he really wasn't. He was the major force of the Reformation as it began, but John Huss was there also in Bohemia. And he was for the limitation of German authority over the Slavic people. He advocated the vernacular in the liturgy, that is, the liturgy to be in the language of the people rather than in Latin. And, interestingly enough, he promoted communion in both species. Now, what I mean by that is, there had gotten in the Middle Ages a custom from the early church on that only the communions would receive the bread, and only the priest would receive the wine. That's called the two species, the bread being one, cup being the other. And of course, in the Bible, in the text, it says, breaking of the bread, we share the bread, and then it said, after supper, he took the cup, blessed it, gave it to them, saying, drink ye all of it. So there was a little disconnect between who got what. Now, in Catholic theology, and in Lutheran teachings too, the fullness of communion is in both species. So that if somebody just takes the bread, for whatever reason, well, let's say you would be giving communion, and you had the chalice of wine and you were giving the bread. And somebody came up that was an alcoholic, and they don't want to take the chalice, and you don't have any option. Some churches have option, they have grape juice or something else. If you gave them the communion with the bread, they would get the full communion even though they didn't take the cup. See what I mean? In other words, it doesn't negate the sacrament. So in the tradition of the church, for several reasons, they had eliminated giving the chalice, but gave the bread. There was some medieval thinking, of course, and we'll talk about this later, about the view, the Catholic view of the Eucharist, of the communion, being the real presence of Jesus, the true body and blood fully in communion. And I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. If you believe that the true presence of Jesus is in the cup, then heaven forbid that the cup should be spilled and that the wine would pitch out on the floor. And there were several writings in medieval times that were, when the chalice was tipped over or dropped, they would clean it up right away, and they would burn the cloths that the wine had been absorbed in. If it were in a piece of carpet, you would actually have to cut the carpet out and ceremoniously take that, because obviously that's Christ's body. You don't want to step on it. Oh, I'm sorry, like that, I know you can't get that on your camera because you're just this high.
Yeah. That's what you think.
Okay, yeah. That's right. But so when you're beginning to understand their thinking, it wasn't, and so just the bread distribution became the normative. And most of you know that up until the time of the Second Vatican Council, which is in our era, Catholics still received just the bread. And but think of this: Huss, predating Luther, before Luther, in Saxony, in Slovakia, that region there, is advocating restoring the cup, which is really quite advanced. So both Wycliffe and Huss, while they created some modernization or some restoration of appropriate church practice, their influence was diminished by political struggles and the fact that they were probably at the wrong time, at the wrong place, and so on. They didn't catch as much fire as Luther will. Had Luther been 100 years earlier, he probably wouldn't have caught fire either, because there was the unique circumstance of Luther being right when printing became available, so that his message from a little place called Wittenberg in Germany could be disseminated quickly across the empire, and that brought a sort of national attention to Luther, which Huss and Wycliffe didn't have, although they were very influential in their own days. In fact, Huss, they became quite militant and became known as the Hussites, and even had military actions to try to convert people to the Huss kind of view. But this is predating, coming before Luther. John Huss, by the way, and Wycliffe, they both had the tragic ends of being burned at the stake as heretics, and so that also would be quite a negative to have anybody really want to stick their neck out, literally, lest it be on the cutting block. The Brethren of the Common Life is a name that you need to know that is not well known. It is mentioned in your text, but it's a very important one. And this comes in the Low Countries, in Holland and Dutch. It's the 13th century, began in the 13th century by Gerhard Grote in the Netherlands. And they decided that they would reform the church by practicing a godly life. In other words, if you saw how sort of pietistic, sort of had great piety, great religious consciousness. They were good people, lived well. They had moral standards and high qualities. If they modeled that, they believed, it would be a sort of a mirror by which you could judge the establishment. In other words, the establishment would look terrible when you saw how good these people were. You'd see how bad they were. And so their efforts at reforming in the Netherlands was to model the godly life. And this was a lay movement, essentially a lay movement. And they practiced what was called Devotio Moderna, which means D-E-V-O-T-I-O, Devotio Moderna, M-O-D-E-R-N-A. It's a communal lifestyle. It's biblical readings, ordered prayer, self-examination, mass attendance, education based not on speculation but on simple truths of the Bible. Now this is what's called devotion, sort of a modern devotion, Devotio Moderna. Lifestyle of a communal life based on the good life, biblical readings, ordered prayer, meaning regular hours of prayer, discipline, self-examination, that means confession, mass attendance, education based on simple biblical principles. And from the 13th century, when they were founded by Grote, G-R-O-O-T-E, Grote, to the 16th century, which is Luther's time. Remember, the centuries are always 100 or one number ahead of the actual year. So if we're in the 1500s, we're in the 16th century, right? Okay. So they lasted for almost 300 years or more, and by that time, because they were learned, because they were devoted, because they had this reputation of the godly life, people gravitated to their communities, this brotherhood of the common life, and became sort of associated with these communities and took lessons from these people. This was a lay movement. This was like the rest of you joining together and saying, enough is enough. We're going to live a godly life, and we're going to center it around Bible study and corporate life, prayer, devotion, frequent mass attendance, and so on. Now, they didn't give up their Catholic faith at all, but they decided that within that Catholic community, they would model a life that was noble and what they considered most Christ-like. And so, by the 16th century, 1500s, now get this, most of the highly educated people, lay people in Europe, in Germany at least, and in the Low Countries, had been educated at one time or another by the Brotherhood of the Common Life. So that if you were, now I'm not talking about the people that, were smart, had a lot of money and went off to the universities. They obviously had it cheap. But the average person on the street, like us, would gravitate to these communities. We would, take their Bible studies. We would immerse ourselves in their devotional life. And much like the monastic communities of our country. That's a good time to mention my friend back here made a pilgrimage. He was so inspired by these lectures that when I mentioned the monastery, the Lutheran monastery in Michigan, they made a pilgrimage up there last week. Do you want to tell us about that? Just very briefly, tell us what it was like.
We were going to go around
St. Augustine's house. Remember I mentioned that to you? Michigan.
We were going to go around Lake Erie, and then when we got to Michigan, we were going to visit her sister. So you have to go across Detroit. And you mentioned just 50 miles north is St. Augusta House.
Right.
So we decided that we would go up there.
See? Power of persuasion, right?
And we were so well received, we got there at 3 o'clock the afternoon, and they were sitting around just talking, general talk. And they said, would you like to go with Vespers with us tonight? And we said, well, yes.
These are the brothers and so
The brothers, yes. And so before Vespers, which was at, I think, 7 o'clock, they took us a tour of the whole place, and it's just beautiful. They got 42 acres up there, and they're just constantly building when they have the money.
Beautiful chapel.
Beautiful, beautiful place. And it's so quiet, and just, as soon as you get there, it's just so much different. And we visited them for 5 hours. We went to Vespers with them, and then we went and had supper with them also.
Great.
I mean, it was
They just brought you right in?
brought you right in. They accepted us right away. You had mentioned it, and then we went back to our church in Newton Falls. We mentioned it to Father Caney, and he says, oh, well, you'll see Father John, and he says also Pastor Richard, that he went to the seminary with.
Mm-hmm.
And so we mentioned those two names, and they just took us in.
Yeah, the proper.
We had the right words.
Well, it's an interesting place, and it may be someplace where you would like to go, and you can stay there. They have rooms there, and you might go for a weekend or a day, a couple days retreat up there. It would be something that you would, and then you join right in with the monastic life, the prayer life, which is sort of what we're talking about with this Brothers of the Common Life, or the monastical orders. This is an example, one even within our Lutheran family. Well worth visiting, St. Augustine's.
The only trouble is, you got 3 miles of dirt road, that 10 mile an hour is pretty fast on it.
Well, that's part of the thing, to be set aside so far out into the country. Well, and I'm glad you shared that with me, and I'm glad you had that experience.
It was the experience.
That's great. So anyhow, the Brothers of the Common Life were very instrumental as the early pre-reformers, Huss and Wycliffe particularly. Now let's look at the Renaissance. The Renaissance is a period of time in which there was an enormous interest in looking back to antiquities. Remember, we're out now into the 1500s, 1600s, and so we're a long ways away from ancient Rome and ancient Egypt and ancient Greece. And there becomes a huge movement of scholars and the intellectual to recapture the wonders that were Rome, the original Rome in its glory days, the wonders of the Greeks, the philosophy of the Greeks, and to reread the ancient texts And so in the Renaissance period, this is a great flowering, after we come through what is called the Dark Ages in Europe, is this time of great flourishing of the arts. And that's known as the Renaissance, in which sculpture and painting and music and literary achievement, poetry and theater and so on is beginning to blossom once again out of this long period of sort of decadence that swept over Europe, known as the Dark Ages. And so ancient texts are being relooked at. Greek and Latin is being studied again. And the poetry of Homer, the teachings of Aristotle and Plato are being revived again, as people are looking back to an earlier time in which they saw it as a higher time, higher standards. Sort of the glory days. That's when the arts flourished. That's when great sculpture was done. That's when great architecture was done. What's happened to us in all these years that everything is sort of the least common denominator? And so they're looking back with great nostalgia at the earlier times, and that's called the Renaissance, meaning the rediscovery, is what it is. To be a student of the Renaissance meant that you were probably known as a humanist. Now, the word humanist has a lot of baggage to us in our day and age, but a humanist was one that had great interest in the arts and literature and the sciences and so on. To be a Renaissance man, a great compliment to someone is that you are a Renaissance man. And what that meant was that you have a great appreciation of music, fine music. You like nice, good wine. You like fine dining with white tablecloths and so on. You're knowledgeable. If somebody mentioned Johann Sebastian Bach, you've heard his music. You know something about that. If somebody mentions Raphael or Rembrandt, yeah, you know that there's paintings by that person. You know what classical architecture looks like. In other words, a Renaissance person is not narrow-minded or narrow-vision, but someone that has this kind of eclectic or this kind of all-inclusive ability to feel at home in the arts and literature and music and culture and so on, and that that you enjoy those things. You enjoy going to the symphony. You enjoy hearing classical music. You enjoy modern jazz. You enjoy walking through a beautiful church and admiring the architecture and the stained glass. And if on a Sunday afternoon you find there's a concert, an organ recital at Stambaugh, and you go there to that. And you're looking in the newspaper, what interesting thing can we do this week? Oh, there's going to be an open house, or there's going to be a tour of homes, or there's going to be a naturalist talk down in Mill Creek. In other words, a Renaissance idea is that you are not monodimensional, that you are enculturated. And our system of education that came out of Europe is best known as the liberal arts education. That's why many colleges are known as liberal arts institutions. And many of the church, most of the church colleges, or I probably could say all of the church colleges, are designed around what is called the liberal arts education. The idea that you should know something about history, you should know something about literature, you should have an acquaintance with science, you should, in other words, that you're not a dum-dum. Now, dum-dums used to be those little things those little lollipops or whatever. But dum-dum can also mean, that you don't know, you know nothing about nothing, right? So the Renaissance idea is to expose you to the great teachings of the world. A humanist followed normally. If you were a student of humanities, you would learn these things. Rhetoric. Now, most people would say, well, what the heck's rhetoric? Rhetoric is the ability to make a cogent, intelligible argument supporting something you believe in. In other words, not shooting from the hip or not being, so light, such a lightweight that you just champion sort of stock phrases or stock arguments. You listen to somebody on the radio, you just blab it back. But that you think through very logically, and if you're going to give an argument for something, that is a defense of something, that you do it in a very logical this is rhetoric. In other words, there's a difference between being able to do public speaking and to do public argumentation. And rhetoric is, the best thing would be to, like the Lincoln-Douglas debates, okay? This isn't like what we saw in our national election where everybody tries to figure out some low blow or some ignorant statement about somebody's hands or something like that. You remember? Little Marco, or, ignorant this, or... That's not what rhetoric was about. Rhetoric was about arguing on an intellectual basis and being able to counter-argue and challenge and so on. Very skillful thing. And there were people that were rhetoricians, meaning people that would be great debaters. You know what I'm talking about? Somebody that has skill, not just... So, to be a humanist in the Renaissance was to have studied rhetoric. Also, moral philosophy. Moral philosophy was basically ethics. To be skilled in knowing what is right and wrong, and the reason why something is right or wrong. So as you're beginning to climb out of the mud and become an intellectual or an educated person, you will be trained in argument and thinking and ethics and history and poetry. Now, isn't that an interesting combination, those four? Rhetoric, ethics, moral philosophy, history, and poetry. Now, poetry, of course, can be broadened to mean literature. In other words, all these great writers that you hear about, like Shakespeare or Schiller or Lessing, or all the great writers, Hemingway. It would be nice if that they're more than just a name, that you've read Steinbeck and you've read Hemingway, and you can appreciate Goethe, the poet, and Schiller, and Shakespeare. What is it? It is better to, well, I don't want to quote Shakespeare now, but the point is to have those kind of mental disciplines, that you raise yourself above the common man to really engage your brain and to appreciate the best things of life, of the human life, that what human beings have given us, not the least common denominator. So you want to raise yourself up to those standards, and to do so, you think logically, you understand ethics and moral principles, you know history, so that you don't fall into the same thing that other people, the same faults, and you know literature, because through the mind of a poet or an author, they can inform your mind in ways that nothing else really can do. Remember when we were in school, we had to learn poetry? Remember that? I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree. Do you remember all that stuff? Okay. So, now, the medieval liberal arts, that was the humanists and the human curriculum. Rhetoric, moral philosophy, ethics, history, poetry. The medieval liberal arts was these things. It's called the triumph. Grammar, how to put together your speaking and your writing in a cogent way. Grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And what was called the Anni Divion, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Now, most of you who have had some college education know that we still have this sort of liberal arts view, that while you can be trained as a great engineer or an architect, you should also know something about music and literature and philosophy and thinking and logic and principles and so on. In other words, the idea of both the humanists and the liberal arts was that we be not not just narrow-minded, narrow-focused. It's true that you can train a physician just to do wiring or piping. Right? If you're a surgeon, you're connecting tubes, cutting and connecting tubes. But it would be far better that a surgeon knows something about morals and ethics, I would hope, and that he has a life beyond just connecting tubes, and that he begins to understand as he relates to you that you can relate as human beings about the softer things of life. What it's like to raise a family, what it's like to be in love, and what it's like to thrill to a sunset and all that kind of thing, because it makes you multidimensional. It fills out your personality. And so that's the objective of the humanist and the Renaissance and the liberal arts. Now this is important because this all factored into the Reformation. Now let's look at Erasmus and the Christian humanism. Erasmus from Holland had the greatest influence in the Renaissance world in thinking because he was a great thinker, and you'll read his story in the book there, but he was the one that was able to translate Greek texts, and he developed a translation of the Bible from the basic Greek, went back to the original texts. Now, the Bible that had been used by the Catholic world, and I'll use that because that's all there was up until this time, basically the Catholic and Orthodox world, was the Vulgate. It was by St. Jerome, and the Vulgate was a translation of the Bible into Latin, and it was the Latin version of the Bible. And the Vulgate then was used by all the scholars for 1,000 years as the main source book to translate and interpret the Bible. Erasmus, however, being part of this Renaissance idea, going back and recapturing the glories of the ancient world, realized that the New Testament had originally been in the Greek. And in the Greek New Testament became then the source book for which he thought was a superior rendering than the Vulgate translation by St. Jerome. Now, of course, this would be sort of heretical, wouldn't it? Because the official position of the church was, this is the Bible, and this is the translation you use. And who's going to contradict St. Jerome? If it was good enough for St. Jerome, it's good enough for me, right? It's like somebody used to say, the King James, the King James is good enough for me. I don't need anything else. King James is it. Well, like the King James Bible that comes later in the process here, we know that new modern translations of the Bible are superior to the King James. Now, the King James has a kind of nostalgic sound to us. On Christmas Eve, I would not read anything except King James. The Christmas story, because it just sounds right in King James, And I even throw in the these, thys, and thous, because you sort of want that sort of mystical, romantic, historical thing. I don't want that cut down English language that, sort of street language, some of these translations are designed for third graders, And it sounds like that they're very choppy, they don't read right. The King James was meant to be sung and to be read orally, and it's written so it's an oral reading. Many of our translations are not meant to be written, to be spoken, They're meaning to be read, and therefore they're choppier. They don't have that kind of rhythm or flow. You know, a swaddling clothes makes sense to me. You know, I don't want a baby diaper, you know, on Christmas Eve. You know, and they found him in a pamper. Okay, I know what you mean, but on Christmas Eve, a pamper, you know, how about a swaddling clothes, right? So, but you see what I mean. And so it's sort of our same reaction, like we just had that reaction, is what the community at that said, what? You mean Jerome's not good enough for us? You mean you've made another translation? Well, who authorized you to make a translation? And of course the church says, well, you're not authorized. You didn't get permission. You know, the Vulgate's good. It's always been good. It'll still be good. And, you know, we're not going to accept it. But this Greek translation became very important because now biblical scholars could go back and see the mistranslations of the Vulgate and also study the original text, including Luther's. See, Luther then uses Erasmus' translation or Greek text when he goes to translate the Bible into German. This Bible will be not, I mean, he'll look at the Vulgate and he'll look at the Greek translation, and then he brings the new German translation. So Erasmus is a very important person. Luther was influenced by Erasmus, later discounted some of Erasmus' point of view, but Erasmus got into England and was important. So in 1516, Erasmus published the first Greek edition of the New Testament versus the Vulgate. 1516. Now, for you that are scholars of the Reformation, know when did Luther tag the thesis on the door of Wittenberg? Was 1517. So you see how close the linking is here? And now you'll see that Luther then will be knowledgeable of this Greek translation. And when he goes into hiding at the Wartburg, which we'll talk about after the popcorn break, he will be looking at these translations. He will be very knowledgeable about moral theology. He will have been educated at the University of Erfurt in the liberal arts and in the humanities, so he knows music, he knows literature, he knows philosophy, he knows Aristotle, and so he's very much at the right time, at the right place to develop this new look for the church called the Reformation. So, with that, let us take a little break and then we'll come back and talk about Marty.